welcome everyone, members and guests, to the Bibliographical Society's winter tour to Mexico. I'm James Raven, President of the Bibliographical Society. It's a great privilege to have everyone with us. At the beginning, can I ask everyone, please, to mute themselves? We're getting very familiar with this now, aren't we, on online Zoom? So can you mute yourselves, please? And also, except for our speakers, whom I'm just going to be introducing in a moment, can everyone else turn off their video as well, please? Because this will save bandwidth. Thank you so much. Now, this is our second online visit, follows the success of our summer virtual visit to the Plume Library. And thanks to the magic of Zoom, we can travel much further. And so we're being more adventurous. I hope everyone is comfortable and ready for our long-range visit. Let me say at the outset that we have to thank a number of people for enabling this. Believe me, this is going to be a real treat, and we're hugely grateful to Professor Lorette Colinas at the Institute of Bibliographical Research at Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico. I should say that's probably Nacional Autónoma de Mexico, being in Mexico, at UNAM in Mexico City, and who is our member of the Society in Mexico. The sole member listed actually in Mexico in our recent published list of members worldwide. Perhaps we're about to extend and expand our Mexican membership, but thank you so much, Lorette. And then here in the UK to Liam Sims for coordinating this, and to other colleagues in Mexico City for allowing us to be with them on this special occasion. Specific thanks are due, and you're going to have, as I say, a real treat. Specific thanks are due to Andres Inigo, who lent his voice to almost all the videos, except those of Dr. Michael Swanton and Carolina Silva Breton, who was in charge of formatting all the videos of the National Library, the introduction, the closing, and the editing of the joint video. And now our speakers. First of all, it's a great pleasure for us to hear from Dr. Baltasar Rito Guadarama, who is head of the National Library of Anthropology and History. Dr. Rito Guadarama has specialized in Mexican codices and the bibliographical history of New Spain and Mexico. He's the author of several articles and nearly 20 books, and since 2013, he's been the director of the National Library of Anthropology and History and the national coordinator of archives of the same institute. He's a member of the Advisory Council of the General Archive of the Nation, of the Council of the Chronicle of the CBMX, and he's also vice president of the Mexican Committee of Memory of the World and a member of the editorial board of various institutions and journals. I'm also delighted to introduce Dr. Maria Isabel Granion Pornia, head of the Francisco de Borja Library in the beautiful city of Oaxaca, which in fact I had the privilege of visiting in person many years ago. Dr. Granion Pornia has focused her field of study on engraving, printing, and 16th century books of New Spain. She has several publications on this subject, and some aimed at children in Mexican art. She is president of the civil association that supports the development of archives and libraries, and director of the Francisco de Borja Library of the Autonomous University Benito Juarez of Oaxaca, one of the most important collections of antique books in Mexico, and included in the memory of the World Register of Mexico by UNESCO. Finally, back in Mexico City, two colleagues from the National Library of Mexico, Professor Pablo Mora Perez Tejeda, director of the Institute of Bibliographical Research at UNAM and of the National Library of Mexico, welcome, where he has also been a full-time researcher since 1994. He's professor of Mexican literature at the Faculty of Philosophy and Letters at UNAM. His research focuses on the review and analysis of bibliographic and newspaper sources on literature in the 19th and early 20th century, as well as on the history of culture between Mexico and Spain during the same period. He's co-responsible since 2019 for the Project Puppet Bibliography of Bibliographies, towards the construction of a model for the history and digital edition of masterpieces of Mexican bibliography. And we also have Dr. Felipe Martinez Arellano, coordinator of the National Library of Mexico and professor in UNAM graduate and undergraduate programs in library science and information studies. His research focuses on information organization, bibliographic conding formats, open access, and institutional repositories. He was formerly director of the University Center for Research in Library Science and technical coordinator of the Academic Information System in the UNAM Coordination of Humanities. He's honorary member of the College of Librarians of Peru, as well as of the Brazilian Federation of Associations of Libraries and is also a member of the Mexican Academy of Sciences. It's a great privilege to have you all with us. I'm now going to hand over to Karen.
Hold on a minute, it has just decided to not want to play along. Let me just start again.
We are happy to wait.
And try again.
The following libraries are, each in its own way, on its own time, a consequence of sustained efforts to achieve what Juan José de Eguiara Yeguren, the first Mexican bibliographer, had already begun in the mid-18th century, when he started compiling what would become his Biblioteca Mexicana. Taking as his model Nicolás Antonio's Biblioteca Hispana, and as a convincing response to Dean Martí's accusation of a total absence of books, libraries, and culture in the West Indies, Eguiara conformed his catalogue. He only managed to publish the first volume, letters A, B, and C, in 1755, and left manuscripts ready for up to letter J. This was the first attempt to write a complete catalogue of texts written in Mexico. By doing this, Eguiara discovered the Mexican literary tradition, which he named Biblioteca Mexicana. His descriptions, so precise and rigorous at the same time, of the authors, the works, and even the material characteristics of the copies he owned, make the Biblioteca Mexicana a fundamental work for the study of the colonial bibliographic production. Later on, another clergyman, José Mariano Beristain de Souza, in his Biblioteca Hispanoamericana Septentrional, anchored what Eguiara had begun, expanding his information in time and in the measure of his own interests, beyond the work of his predecessor. Nevertheless, the works described by Eguiara and Beristain are no longer all in Mexico, due to the importance that Mexican bibliography acquired for foreign collectors. The collecting phenomenon granted the dispersion of the Mexican bibliographic heritage. The libraries that we present today are indispensable repositories which collect and preserve important books of the Mexican bibliographic legacy. These libraries follow the traces of the evolution of written culture in Mexico, the place foreign influences have had, and how these have united with local elements to conform what is today's Mexican bibliography. The National Library of Anthropology and History is the largest documentation center of the National Institute of Anthropology and History of Mexico. This library contains a whole universe of specialized books and manuscripts at the service of the different disciplines that study human beings in their development through time, including history, ethnohistory, social anthropology, physical anthropology, ethnology, archaeology, and linguistics. It is also the safekeeper of our country's bibliographic and documentary heritage, as it is obliged by law to conserve, develop, study, and project the collections it jealously guards. To understand the history of the library, we must go back to the year 1825, when Guadalupe Victoria, the first president of independent Mexico, thanks to the advice of Lucas Alamán, a prestigious politician and historian of that time, established the National Museum of Mexico. In the words of its first curator, a room was set aside there to house the masterpieces of antiquities and natural history, whether manuscript or printed, that make our territory known. 4 decades later, that room became more important and was given the status of a department. This happened in 1865, during the Second Mexican Empire, when Maximilian of Habsburg gave the museum its own building and reorganized its collections into 3 departments, one for natural history, one for archaeology and history, and one for the library. Although those events are important in the development of our repository, it was not until December 22, 1888, during Porfirio Díaz's government, that the museum library was formally inaugurated. The prestigious historian Francisco del Paso y Troncoso was in charge of cutting the ribbon and appointing as the first librarian the polygrapher José María de Ágreda y Sánchez, whose election was preceded by his wide experience as polygrapher of the General Archive of the Nation, and also by demanding guardian seal he forged when he was the last person in charge of the Turriana Library, the first public library in Mexico that had belonged to the Metropolitan Cathedral. In modern Mexico, with the creation of the National Institute for Anthropology and History in 1939, the museum library became the central library of the institute. In 1976, it added to its official name the name of its director, Dr. Eusebio Dávalos Hurtado, a heartfelt homage to one of the most notable physical anthropologists of our country, who unfortunately died in 1968 at the age of 59. As we outlined above, the museum library was first housed in the building that once housed New Spain's Mint, just behind the present-day National Palace, the same place where the National Museum of Cultures now resides. Although its location within the building varied over time, it finally occupied an important space on the ground floor of the building around 1909, where it had large space to house its growing collections and also to accommodate the avid readers who assiduously visited its facilities. By that time, the old wooden bookcases were replaced by elegant and efficient metal shelves from the United States. Its location, in the very center of the country's capital, made the library one of the most popular meeting points for scholars and intellectuals in the last years of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th. In 1964, modernity reached the National Museum. In that year, the Mexican government decided to move its archaeological collections and the National Institute of Anthropology and History Central Library to the new facilities built in the Chapultepec Park. Now, amidst abundant vegetation, the thick colonial stone walls were replaced by marble, wood, glass, steel, and aluminum. The library was installed on the first floor of the building designed by the architect Pedro Ramírez Vázquez, where it benefited from large consultation rooms and plenty of space to house more than 250,000 volumes, and the thousands of manuscripts that no longer fit in its old facility. In addition, only a corridor separated our library from the National School of Anthropology, so that those budding students and also established researchers had within reach all the material they needed to carry out their academic research. The bibliographic and documentary universe of the library is currently extremely vast. It has a general collection of 500,000 items, which is constantly being developed. It owns an important historical newspaper library, a photo library, a map library, and an archive of the same nature, a rich sound archive made up of the field recordings of important ethnomusicologists and the oral testimony of different and little-known actors in national history. Its precious collection holds European incunabula and thousands of books printed from the 16th century to the first half of the 20th. The conventual collection housed on the middle floor holds more than 28,000 titles from various convents and colleges in New Spain. Undoubtedly, its Mexican Codex collection is the most important in our country and the one that has placed our library in the world limelight. We hold 200 of the approximately 550 Mesoamerican codices known in the world, which is why, since 1997, it has been recognized by UNESCO as a memory of the world. The Fray Francisco de Burgoa Library is responsible for conserving, preserving, and projecting the bibliographic and documentary heritage of the Benito Juárez Autonomous University of Oaxaca, with the aim of developing a social space for reflection on historical memory and care of the cultural legacy. The Burgoa Library is located inside the former convent of Saint Dominic of Guzman in the city of Oaxaca, a building that was inhabited by Dominican friars during the 17th and 18th centuries and until the first decade of the 19th century. The origin of the Fray Francisco de Burgoa Library dates back to 1826, when Governor José Ignacio de Morales decreed the creation of the Institute of Sciences and Arts of the state of Oaxaca. Formally, the institute began to work on January 8, 1827, and according to the decree of creation, the establishment of a library was ordered. Its collection would contain the most selected works about science and arts. And indeed, the creation of the library and its first regulations were published on June 27, 1827. They stated that the library of the Institute was public. In the 1840s, the Institute of Sciences and Arts moved to the former convent of St. Paul, where Porfirio Diaz would study, and Benito Juárez, who would become president, imparted lectures. By 1857, the expropriation of the goods of the different ecclesiastical corporations was decreed, a decision that affected not only the ecclesiastical buildings, but also the collections of books and manuscripts owned by religious orders. The newspaper La Democracia published the decree, which ordered that the books, printed matter, manuscripts, paintings, antiques, and other objects belonging to the suppressed religious communities will be given to museums, lyceums, libraries, and other public establishments. In Oaxaca, the only public library subsidized by the state government was the Library of the Institute of Sciences and Arts. Therefore, and in compliance with the provision, in 1859, the district judge, Felix Romero, supervised that the collection of the Library of the Dominican Order was effectively transferred to the shelves of the Library of the Institute of Sciences and Arts of the state of Oaxaca. In this context, the building of the Colegio Seminario de la Santa Cruz, today the central building of the Faculty of Law, was requisitioned to become the headquarters of the Institute, which until then had been housed in St. Paul's Convent. The Institute and its library underwent still more transformations, one of which took place on January 18, 1955, when Oaxacan society awoke to the news that the Institute of Sciences and Arts had become the Benito Juárez University of Oaxaca. In the month of April of that same year, the library of the Institute, which contained the old collection of books that had belonged to the libraries of the different religious orders and the works used by the students, was handed over to the newly founded university. In 1958, the old collection of the library was moved to the Cinco de Mayo building. The Faculty of Architecture was installed in the same place, and then several difficulties arose that caused the loss and damage of some copies of the collection. At the end of the 20th century, the books were moved again to the General José Vasconcelos Library. There, the conditions were less than optimal for the books. It was not until 1994 that the cataloging of the Vasconcelos Library's antique collection began, with special interest in the books from the convents and used by the students of the Institute in the middle of the 19th century. Some years later, the National Institute of Anthropology and History intervened and assigned a specific space to the collections. The former convent of St. Dominic of Guzman was chosen. The collection, comprising some 24,000 copies, was placed in its current repository in 1994, and in 1996 it was inaugurated under the name of the Fray Francisco de Burgoa Library. The cultural heritage of the Volgoa Library is made up of three collections. The first is the antique one, that contains books that were part of the convents of Antequera del Valle de Oaxaca, and some copies that belonged to the Antequera bishops during the colonial period. To this collection belong the 12 incunabula that the library owns, as well as the books known as the first printed books of the Americas. The second is the historical collection, which comprises the books that belonged to the library of the Institute of Sciences and Arts. The volumes are about medicine, geography, languages, typography, and other arts. We also consider part of the historical collection the books that were donated by former students of the Institute and intellectuals, such as Benito Juárez, Matías Romero, Manuel Brioso y Candiani, Aurelio Valdivieso, and Jorge Fernando Iturribarría. Finally, the modern collection is made up of books donated by authors who have written about the history of Oaxaca. In this same collection, we can find the academic works of all those researchers who consulted the Burgoa's library collection for their postgraduate work. The topics range from the history of Oaxaca to 20th century art. Because of the richness of its collections, the Burgoa Library has been essential for research related to history and art. It is not surprising that in 2018 it was recognized as a Memory of the World by the UNESCO. The National Library of Mexico is located in the south of Mexico City, in the heart of the university city of the National Autonomous University of Mexico. The architectural complex where it is located is known as the Bibliographic Unit. It houses both the National Library of Mexico and the National Periodicals Library of Mexico, as well as the Bibliographical Research Institute, which administers both. The Bibliographic Unit consists of two sections, the Contemporary Collection and the Reserved Collection, where the oldest printed material is preserved, as well as manuscripts, archives, and miscellaneous documents. These two sections are linked by a passageway known as the Tunnel of Time. Various sculptures adorn the interior, such as Erzua's, the symbol of the sciences and humanities, or Federico Silva's Vino. There are also busts of eminent personalities, such as the writer Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz and former President Benito Juárez. It was Juárez who issued the decree for the foundation of the library on November 30, 1867. He also gave its first headquarters, the old temple of St. Augustine, in the historic center of Mexico City. Previously, there had been several failed attempts to establish the library in 1833, 1846, and 1857. There was also, during the French intervention, a project of creating an imperial library, which turned out in the removal from the country of collections and books acquired for this purpose and their subsequent auctioning in Europe. The necessary renovation work for converting a church into a library began in 1867 and was completed in 1884. The opening ceremony was held on the 2nd of April, 1884. The former president, Manuel González, attended the ceremony. Speeches were delivered and poems were recited, and a symphonic hymn of the library was performed. In 1893, the library opened its night service in the chapel of the Third Order to meet the reading needs of the working classes. The former president Porfirio Díaz and his cabinet attended the inauguration ceremony, as well as the director of the library for almost 30 years, José María Vigil. In 1914, the law of the National University was issued. It listed the organizations belonging to this institution, mostly faculties and institutes, and among them it was the National Library of Mexico. The organic law of the university, issued in 1929, ratified this assignment. From that time onwards, the National Library of Mexico has been under the custody of the National Autonomous University of Mexico. In 1950, when the construction of University City began, it was envisaged to move the National Library of Mexico to the building today known as the Central Library. At last, this proposal was rejected. However, traces of this attempt remain on one of the beautiful murals that embellish this building, on which the initials BN and HN are inscribed, which stand for Biblioteca Nacional and Hemeroteca Nacional. In 1967, the Bibliographical Research Institute was created as a part of the university, and it was stipulated that the National Library and the National Periodicals Library of Mexico would be under its administration. In 1979, the current headquarters of the National Library of Mexico was inaugurated. Thus began the transfer of the library's collections from the historic center to the south of Mexico City. The bibliographic unit was designed by the architect Orso Núñez, who was also responsible for the construction of the surrounding buildings, cinemas, theaters, and concert halls. The architectural ensemble is known as the University Cultural Center. Initially, the bibliographic unit housed only the library's contemporary collection, while the reserved collection remained for a few more years in the old church of St. Augustine. It was not until 1992 that the architectural section where the library's reserved collection is located was inaugurated. Finally, in 1995, all the books had been moved to the new location, which meant the end of an era. St. Augustine's building, the temple that held the library for over a century, was closed. It underwent a process of architectural intervention in order to reinforce its structure. Regarding the future of the National Library of Mexico, there are plans to build a documentary preservation center outside Mexico City, in Juriquilla, Querétaro, which is 2.5 hours away from the city. A significant part of its collection will be transferred there. Thus, it will prevent the bibliographic unit from becoming overcrowded, and it will meet the needs of storage space for the decades to come. There are also plans for the library's original home, the former church of St. Augustine. The building has undergone an extensive restoration process, which is in its final stage. In its adjacent chapel, better known as the Chapel of the Third Order, the National Library will house its typological collection, a reference room for digital collections, the National Press, and a venue for academic teaching and outreach activities. Thus, the history of the National Library of Mexico encounters the present time, enlivened by the lessons of its past and impatient to meet the challenges of its future. The Media Codex is one of Mexico's oldest codices held by the library. Together with the Dresden, Paris, and Madrid codices, it makes up a group of pre-Hispanic manuscripts belonging to the Maya culture. Since its public appearance in 1971 at the Grolier Club in New York, its existence has been shrouded in myths about its discovery, and doubts about its originality have marked it for more than 4 decades. Although it has been studied by prestigious researchers since its appearance, the uncertainty surrounding its provenance and temporality has not been indisputably resolved yet. For this reason, in 2017, a transdisciplinary commission was created by the National Institute for Anthropology and History, led by the National Library of Anthropology and History and the National Coordination of Museums and Exhibitions. Historians, archaeologists, epigraphers, physicists, biologists, geologists, and forensic entomologists managed to unravel new secrets surrounding this Mesoamerican document. Some of the conclusions and news that were published are that the codex arrived at a museum in 1974, when it was sent by Josué Sáenz, its owner at that time, for the purpose of being studied and with the instruction that, if it turned out to be original, it would be donated to the museum's library for safekeeping. The analysis discovered that it was made from a mate paper from Amoraceae. Plaster was used as primer, and pigments such as cochineal and Mayan blue for the pictographs. The research also determined that a large part of the deterioration of the document was caused by insects in the original archaeological context. Furthermore, it was clear that it is an almanac dedicated to the planet Venus. Its purpose was to prevent and correct bad omens. Finally, it was confirmed that it was produced in the early post-classic period, around the 12th century. Therefore, it is the oldest legible books of the Americas. Among the library's codices from the colonial period, the so-called Codex Chavero de Huejotzingo stands out. It belongs to a group of 5 documents inherited from the scriptural tradition of this ancient Nahua lordship of the Poblano-Tlaxcala Valley, which were produced during the 16th century, and, as a whole, allow us to study the tax system developed in the region during the 1st century of the Spanish domination. It belonged to the collection of Lorenzo Boturini. In the 19th century, the codex was handed to Alfredo Chavero, a famous 19th century historian and archaeologist, who decided to donate it to the National Museum of Mexico in 1906. Currently, the Chavero Codex is part of the collection of the National Library of Anthropology and History. The codex is made up of 18 plates of 31.5 by 43 centimeters, which are part of a legal proceeding that the community of Huejotzingo brought against its indigenous authorities for abuses committed in the collection of taxes. Thus, in pictographic writing, the tax paid by the 21 neighborhoods of the Huejotzinca Altepetl between 1571 and 1577 was recorded. It consisted of money, corn, shirts, and blankets. All these items were represented with their corresponding glyph. The Mesoamerican numerical system recorded in the Codex Chavero has variants that were only used by this specific lordship. If we look closely at the pictographs, we will see that to represent the quantities from 1 to 9, the object was painted and counted as many times as necessary. To express the number 10, a rhombus was used. For the number 15, a crescent moon. 20 was represented with a flag or a corn cob, 400 with a lock of hair or a tzontli, and 8,000 with a bag. It is noteworthy that any quantity could be represented by using only these numerals. The Chimalpahin Codex is one of the most recent acquisitions of the library. It consists of 3 volumes bound in parchment, written between the 16th and the 17th centuries by Fernando de Alba Ixtlilxochitl, a native of Texcoco and descendant of the famous Aztec king and poet Nezahualcóyotl, and Domingo de San Antonio Muñón Chimalpajin Cuauhtlehuanitzin, successor to the lord of Chalcoamecameca. When Ixtlilxochitl died, the manuscripts were inherited by Juan de Alba Cortés, his son, who in turn gave them to the famous scholar from New Spain, Carlos de Sigüenza y Góngora. Later, in the 19th century, when the Codex was in the library of the Colegio de San Ildefonso, the historian José María Luis Mora traded it for Protestant Bibles with the Bible Society of London. In 2014, the Mexican government, through the Ministry of Culture and the National Institute of Archaeology and History, repatriated them, and they were exhibited for the first time in the exhibition Mexican Codices, Memories and Knowledge. Unlike other manuscripts in the collection, the Chimalpajin Codex lacks pictographs, since its authors used only Latin characters in Spanish and Nahuatl. The work tells the historical development of the first peoples settled in central Mexico, from the creation of the world until the arrival of the Spaniards. This historical narration is enriched with the information about traditions, daily life, genealogies, and calendars. It also contains a history of the rulers of Tenochtitlan and Texcoco, and the oldest known copy in Nahuatl of the Crónica Mexicayotl by Fernando Alvarado Tezosomoc, a descendant of the Mexica Tenochca nobility. With their works, the above-mentioned indigenous authors sought to insert Mesoamerican history and traditions into universal historiography, which is why we can consider these manuscripts as the beginning of Mexican historiography. The ancient collection of the library is a miscellany of documents made up of just over 1,000 items from the 16th to the 19th century, all of which are first-hand sources for studying some of the historical processes that have shaped the Mexican nation. Although there is no manuscript in this collection that is not interesting, there is one in particular that is closely linked to the diffusion of so-called Mexican antiquities during the 19th century. This is manuscript number 747, an album catalogued as Dibujos en Negro de Antigüedades Mexicanas por el señor Luciano Castaneda, dibujante del Museo Nacional de México. Drawings in black of Mexican antiquities by Mr. Luciano Castaneda, draftsman of the National Museum of Mexico. Castaneda accompanied Guillermo Dupé, explorer and captain of dragoons, on the Royal Antiquarian expedition that he undertook through New Spain between 1805 and 1809. Castaneda's task was to draw in situ the archaeological monuments that the Capitan located during his expeditions, especially in Huatusco, Cholula, Mitla, Monte Albán, Palenque, and other sites of interest. Later, this artwork was manipulated and used by many European publishers to illustrate their publications on Mexican antiquities. Among them, we can mention Lord Kingsborough, who reproduced several plates in his monumental work Antiquities of Mexico, whereas Jean-Henri Baradère did the same in his Antiquités mexicaines, Relation des trois expéditions du Capitaine Dupé. We know that Baradère received from Isidro Ignacio Icaza, curator of the National Museum, the illustrations by Castaneda, which he took to Europe and used for his work. However, these originals, made by Castaneda himself, remained in the museum as silent witnesses of those early archaeological expeditions. The four examples that we will see in a few moments are insufficient to get to know the richness of our collections. However, they are important enough to affirm that the bookshelves of the National Library of Anthropology and History not only hold ancient books and documents, but also preserve part of the historical heritage bequeathed for generations to all Mexicans and to humanity.
In the wake of the Spanish conquest and colonization of the lands that Hernán Cortés named New Spain, the Spanish crown granted the friars of the mendicant orders considerable powers to achieve the evangelization of the indigenous population. The friars of one of these orders, the Order of Preachers, also known as the Dominicans, focused their efforts in the southern part of this territory, one of the most linguistically diverse regions on Earth. This region corresponds rather closely to the present-day Mexican states of Oaxaca and Chiapas, and continues to be home to a diversity of indigenous languages. The linguistic diversity of this region meant that the Dominicans could no longer rely on Nahuatl, the language of the so-called Aztecs that was dominant in the central plateau of Mexico, for communication with the native population. Because of its settlement density and wealth, the Mixtec area of southern New Spain attracted the attention of the Dominicans early on. It is there where many of their earliest and most spectacular church and monastery complexes were built and can still be admired today. As part of this ambitious religious project, the Dominicans, working with early Mixtec converts, developed an alphabetic script for writing the Mixtec language. Their first book was the Doctrina Cristiana en Lengua Mixteca of Friar Benito Hernández, printed by Pedro Ocharte in 1568. Two versions of this work were produced, one in the Mixtec dialect spoken in the area of Achutla, and another spoken in the area of Tepozcolula, farther to the north. These massive volumes, of approximately 200 folio each, are almost entirely monolingual in Mixtec. The elegant style of language that Friar Benito and his Mixtec assistants used to describe the new religious content, combined with the beautiful Gothic typeset and spectacular woodcuts, made this book very popular among Mixtec readers for over a century. The Tepozcolula Doctrina, much like Luther's Bible or Dante's Divina Commedia, established a standard orthography for the Mixtec language that lasted for over 2 centuries. Only 5 known examples of the Tepozcolula Doctrina of Friar Benito are known to exist, many of which are little more than mutilated fragments. The most complete example of this book is that of the Burgawa Library, which is also the only example in a Mexican public collection, fortunately in Oaxaca. Besides for being a unique witness to a transformative moment in Mexican history, the Doctrina has a special value as the first alphabetic text in the Mixtec language, a language that is spoken by hundreds of thousands of Mixtec people today, most of whom continue to live in the state of Oaxaca. The first printing of the Institución, Modo de Rezar, y Milagros e Indulgencias del Rosario de la Virgen María of Jerónimo Taish was produced in the presses of Juan Pablos, America's first printer, in 1559. The holdings of the Burgawa Library include the 1576 edition of this work, printed by Pedro Bali. It is considered the 6th printing and the 3rd Mexican edition. It is the only known example of this edition. The 1576 edition was corrected and amended by Domingo de Salazar of the Order of Preachers before he was granted the bishopric of Manila. The devotion of the Rosary is fundamental for the Dominicans. In New Spain, it was propagated by the subprior of the church and monastery of Santo Domingo de Mexico, Fray Tomás de San Juan. The Brotherhood of the Holy Rosary was established in 1538, and its devotion is reflected in the artistic expression of the impressive chapels dedicated to the Virgin of the Rosary in the churches of Santo Domingo, both in Oaxaca City and in Puebla. Taish's work combines an explanation of the theological foundation for the devotion to the Rosary with the rules of the Brotherhood. It also includes narratives about the miraculous events associated with the devotion. The presence of the Rosary in the evangelization of New Spain is reflected in documents such as the Media Codex, a 16th century indigenous pictographic document from the Mixtec region of Oaxaca. Francisco de Burgoa, the 17th century chronicler of the Dominicans in Oaxaca, also mentions that plays were performed representing some of the miracles of the Holy Rosary.
The importance of the Burgoa library could not be fully understood without mentioning the works of local authors, such as the books written by Fray Francisco de Burgoa himself, which are a mandatory reference for the study of the history and art of the current state of Oaxaca. Francisco de Burgoa was born in Oaxaca in 1604. In a well-off family, not precisely wealthy, but of great reputation and antiquity. At the age of 15, he joined the Order of Preachers, where he stood out for his dedication to study, mastery of Latin, and solid training in theology and arts. As a friar, he taught Christian doctrine in Mixtec and Zapotec-speaking villages. Thanks to this, he integrated the mastery of both languages and the knowledge of the customs and ways of life of the indigenous people of his time. In 1670, Volgoa published his Palestra Historial de Virtudes, historical sample of virtues, which he began to write as part of his duties as prior of the Antiquera convent. Antiquera was the name of Oaxaca during the colonial period. This book recounts the arrival of the Order of Preachers in the West Indies from the 16th century onwards, the creation of the province known as Saint Hippolytus Martyr of Oaxaca, and the Dominican expansion throughout its territory, all through the biographical account of 31 exemplary lives of contemporary Dominican friars. Another of Burgoa's works is the geographical description of the northern part of the Arctic Pole of America. Geográfica descripción de la parte septentrional del polo ártico de la América, written between 1669 and 1670 and published in 2 volumes until 1674. The Dominican friar decided to increase the information presented in his Palestra Historial by setting out in detail the geography, climates, natural resources, economy, and cultures of the Saint Hippolytus province of Antequera. Both works are fundamental to understand the image of Oaxaca at the end of the 17th century, its people, the customs and languages spoken in different towns, as well as the production of grana cochinilla, cochineal, the dye that made Antequera famous in the whole world, and of course, about the construction of civil and religious buildings. La Dendrología Natural y Botanología Americana, o Tratado de los Árboles y Hierbas de la América, Natural Dendrology and Botanics, or Treatise About the Trees and Herbs of America, is a 58-leaf hand-illuminated booklet on the plants of Oaxaca. It is a key work for documenting the history of botanical knowledge in Oaxaca during the colonial period and one of the few iconographic herbaria from that time. The author, Fray Juan Caballero, was an enlightened friar of the 18th century, whose intellectual activity was not only centered on science, but he also had a prolific career within the Dominican order. He distinguished himself for his studies on plants, animals, and meteorological phenomena, and published articles in the Gaceta de México, such as news on medicinal herbs, the cochineal, epidemics, and on the hot air balloons raised in Oaxaca in 1785. The Dendrología is not only an important work from a scientific or botanical point of view. The beauty of its images shows the artistic quality of the draughtsman and is also very significant for the history of art in New Spain. We do not know the written work that must have accompanied the drawings of the Dendrología. Don Manuel Martínez Gracida says that Fray Juan Caballero wrote the Historia de muchas plantas que crecen en la provincia de Oaxaca, which existed in the library of Santo Domingo, but unfortunately was lost. Caballero manifested an interest in science during his lifetime and surely had at his disposal several books and manuscripts on herbalism, both European and indigenous, and must have consulted the Dominican library, since his research quotes the most modern publications of his time. It is likely that his desire to produce a treatise on the plants of America is a response to the efforts of other naturalists who preceded him and directed their research to classify the flora. His intention was to identify, in a practical way, the plant in question, and in doing so he took the first steps towards a catalogue of the Mexican flora. The booklet has blank pages, and the friar may have wanted to do a more ambitious work, but he was unable to finish it. This work is not only of interest to academic specialists, but has also served as inspiration for artists, masters of folk art, and the ethnobotanical garden of Oaxaca itself. The Burgawa Library owns many works from the 19th century, such as Francisco Bonecchi's Elementary Notions of Linear and Natural Drawing, opuscule for the use of young people who start with their basic art training, published in 1851. It is a work about the theory and practice of drawing, written by one of the most authoritative figures on the subject. Bonecchi excelled in the practice and teaching of painting in Oaxaca in the mid-19th century and was a constant promoter of artistic education in the state of Oaxaca, as well as a prolific thinker who wrote in the local newspapers. Both his pictorial and literary works reflect a vision of progressive history through the representation of the heroes and events that consolidated the nationalist project led by the liberals. Bonecchi studied drawing and painting at the Instituto de Ciencias y Artes del Estado. By 1840, he moved to Mexico City to enroll at the Academy of San Carlos, but had to return to Oaxaca shortly afterwards due to lack of financial solvency. On his return to his hometown, the painter, in accordance with current ideas, began to see art as a possibility for transforming society. Part of this thinking was expressed in his opusculo, in which he defended the old view of painting as a liberal art, a product of the intellect that obliges the artist and the teacher to have theoretical knowledge of mathematics. The book is written in the form of a dialogue between teacher and pupil, with easily understood questions and answers about the definitions of drawing, perspective, the form of the body, movements, and gestures, as well as some notions of architecture. The book was a resounding success, as it had a second edition, of which no copies have survived, a third in 1866, and a fourth in 1872. Moreover, the opusculo became one of the basic books for the drawing class at the Instituto de Ciencias y Artes del Estado, where Bonecchi had been a teacher since the 1860s. Nowadays, some of the exercises that the students carried out during their studies at the Instituto are kept in the Fray Francisco de Burgoa Library. The manuscript Cantaris Mexicanos is one of the most valuable treasures of the National Library of Mexico's reserved collection. It is a volume in cuarto made of 258 leaves on linen woven paper, very well preserved, in which one can observe the late paper and the watermarks. The volume contains 12 texts. The manuscript starts with a title page featuring an elegant oval cartouche decorated with scrolls in red, green, and ochre. The titles are announced on the inside of the cartouche. The first of these is Cantaris Mexicanos, Mexican Songs, which gives its name to the manuscript. It is a very extensive text, commissioned entirely to collect poetic compositions of the Nahua peoples of central Mexico of the 15th and 16th centuries, known as the post-classic period. In this collection, the most beautiful creations of the Nahuatl language are treasured. It contains profound thoughts on love and death, on the search for God, and on the man's destiny in the afterlife. All the poems are written with elegant metaphors and rhetorical figures that embellish the language. The following two texts refer to the calendario and the arte adivinatoria de los antiguos mexicanos. They were compiled by Fray Bernardino de Sahagún and are transcriptions from books 2 and 4 of the Historia General de las Cosas de la Nueva España, the universal history of the things of New Spain, that Sahagún wrote throughout his life between 1547 and 1577. Here we can see part of this history, the one which corresponds to the solar calendar divided into 18 months of 20 days, each of them with its own feast to the tutelary god, and the correspondence of the Mesoamerican calendar with the Gregorian calendar. Regarding Arte Adivinatoria, or Tonalamatl, which means Book of Destiny, it is a ritual calendar of 260 days, each of them with its favorable or unfavorable sign. In these two chapters, two computations of time are kept, the solar and the ritual. At last come the writings that make up the miscellany of evangelization. In those texts, the new Christian and Renaissance message is presented, influenced by the rhetoric of Nahuatl. The first one is a collection of examples, exempla, taken from the medieval tradition. There are two texts dedicated to the preaching on death. The miscellany is enriched with a selection from Aesop's fable. There are 47 fables in which there is an adaptation of the animals of the old world to the new one. The last of the texts that make up this manuscript is the story of the Passion of our Lord Jesus Christ in Mexican language, maybe the longest version of the Passion preserved in Mexican repositories and archives. To sum up, these 12 texts constitute a sample of the literature of 16th century, a literature that embraces two languages and two cultures. On one hand, the post-classical thought and poetry of the Nahua peoples, and even more, of Mesoamerican culture. On the other, a miscellany of evangelization in which Judeo-Christian and Renaissance thought is present. All of this can be seen in the book on thread paper with italic script, codex-like paintings, and a cover with cartouche and classical scrolls. A great treasure from the National Library of Mexico's reserved collection that nowadays we can enjoy as humanists. The National Library of Mexico preserves a copy of a work that for a long time was fundamental for anyone interested in learning about the feats of the conquest of Mexico. It is the work written by the Castilian chronicler Francisco López de Gómara, Historia de México con el descubrimiento de la Nueva España, conquistada por el muy ilustre y valeroso príncipe Don Fernando Cortés, Marqués del Valle, published in Antwerp by Juan Stilcio in 1554. López de Gómara is considered a controversial chronicler because he never set foot on America. In fact, he was only a boy of about 10 years old during the fall of Tenochtitlan, so his knowledge of the conquest of Mexico comes mainly from the sources and communications of Hernán Cortés himself, of whom López de Gómara was chaplain. López de Gómara first published his work as La Historia de las Indias y Conquista de México in 1552. The first edition was printed in 2 columns in Gothic script. Subsequently, Millán's print shop also produced the first and second part of the general history of the Indies, with the discovery and notable things that have happened since they were won until the year 1551, with the conquest of Mexico in New Spain. Printed in Zaragoza, funded by Miguel Capilla and printed in Agustín Millán House in 1552. In 1553 appeared the Hispania Victrix, primera y segunda parte de la Historia General de las Indias. The popularity of the work was evident, as from 1554, the part of the conquest of Mexico began to be printed separately. The Flemish printers active in the port of Antwerp, with established careers such as Juan Stilcio, active between 1532 and 1562, published Historia de México con el descubrimiento de la Nueva España. The Flemish editions of Lopez de Gomara's works respond to a publishing strategy of printers with a broad commercial and editorial vision of quite experienced men, such as Juan Stilcio, as they were aimed at a wide and international public. To begin with, the format was reduced from the bulky folio to the practical octavo, thus lowering costs by saving paper. The text was also distributed in a single column, and the typeface was no longer Gothic but Italic and Roman, making it more modern and more oriented towards the products of European humanism of the 16th century. In addition, the title page included the coat of arms of Hernán Cortés instead of the imperial coat of arms of the Habsburgs, as in the Spanish editions. These Flemish editions, reduced in format, with a more modern typeface for that time, less solemn than the Gothic, and with tables and indexes for the readers, enjoyed great popularity and an enormous international distribution thanks to the impetus and commercial networks established by the Flemish printers in Antwerp. So they must be considered as first-rate publishing products that respond directly to the tastes and demands of the readers of that time. The value of astrology in the societies of the ancient regime was much greater than it is today. We must consider that it consisted of a series of studies that tried to understand the movement of the stars and their close relationship with the Aristotelian paradigm of the humors, which, among other things, dominated the medical and public health field. In this case, the work of Enrico Martinez represents a significant moment in the history of prognostication in Mexico. His Repertorio de los Tiempos of 1606 is a sample of the astrological practice that was performed in New Spain at the beginning of the 17th century. From a bibliographical point of view, it represents a valuable work because of the material elements included. The work is divided into 5 treatises. The first one has 45 chapters and deals with the heavenly bodies, as well as astrological questions. The second begins with the study of the elements, fire, air, water, and air, and continues with questions of New Spain's geography and history in 33 chapters. The third highlights the relationship between the celestial signs and their influence on events in Mexico in 23 chapters. The fourth has a clearly declaratory dimension, as in its 10 chapters it explains to the reader medical issues under the paradigm of humors and the movement of stars. The fifth one describes specific astrological events, such as the conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn on December 24, 1603. Finally, Enrico Martinez added a last section of the memorable things that happened in this new world. Within the astrological explanations, Martinez included a section where the reader could learn about the zodiac signs and discover what the temperamental and personality characteristics of both men and women born under a certain sign were. On folio 140, there is an engraving with a horoscope that graphically explains the transit of the Earth through the solar ecliptic, where the 12 zodiac signs are represented. A material feature that distinguishes this work from other almanacs is that Martinez included the instrument for calculating the zodiac sign under which a person was born. For this, it is necessary to know the day and hour of birth in order to look for the hour in the circle of the hours, and on it he will place the thread that is attached to the center of the instrument, so that it is taut, and having it thus he will move the wheel until the month and day of his nativity is under the thread, and being the wheel in this way he will see which sign comes to be in the line that goes from A to B. That is said to represent the horizon, and that one will be the sign in which he or she was born. Llanto de las estrellas al ocaso del sol anochecido en el oriente, a work that came out in 1725 from the workshop of the renowned printer José Bernardo de Ogal, is a valuable sample of New Spain's culture that can be appreciated from many different angles: visual, literary, social, and bibliographical. The volume, in quarto, contains a detailed description of the solemn funeral spectacle held in Mexico City in honor of the young King Louis I of Spain, whose sudden death impeded him from completing the first year of his reign. Its pages detail the tomb erected in his name and include poetic texts, both in Latin and Spanish, dedicated to the memory of the tender monarch, which are accompanied by remarkable engravings that, as a whole, make the document a window that allows us to peek into the splendor of viceregal culture. In the text, the funeral pyre is presented as the sum of the universe and the king being an imitation of the sun. The original idea was conceived by two artists of great prestige in New Spain. We owe the works to the Jesuit Francisco Javier de Cárdenas. We have very little information about him, and the emblems to the painter and gilder Francisco Martínez. However, the proposal by this duo was only the starting point, because in the material we find today, in the Llanto de las Estrellas, we have the mark of other great New Spain artists, all gathered in the pages of this book with the aim of symbolizing the mourning brought about by the lamentable death of the king, and to consecrate his memory, taking up again the original proposal of Cárdenas and Martínez. The volume contains mainly works by New Spain's poet José de Villerías y Ruelas, as well as engravings by Francisco Silverio, who was the head of one of the most prolific engraving workshops in New Spain during the first half of the 18th century, and which make Llanto de las Estrellas a work of great importance in the history of books and printing in Mexico. Thus, in its almost 150 folios, for which could be considered as an extensive work, it is possible to appreciate woodcut and intaglio engravings, notable capitular letters, typographic vignettes, and a title page with a complete border. At the end, there are also several sermons in honor to the king's death. For all these reasons, Llanto de las Estrellas exposes one of the many celebrations dedicated to Louis I on both sides of the Atlantic, and thus demonstrates the close ties between the society of New Spain and the crown, as well as its active participation in the life of the Hispanic monarchy. When planning to publish México y sus alrededores, José de Caen, the editor, intended to highlight the capital of Mexico as the most important city in Latin America, for its climate, for the beauty of its landscapes, for its architectural development, and for the cultural mix, for which it would compete with other great cities of the world. As Humboldt warned when he stated that Mexico should be counted among the most beautiful cities that Europeans have founded in both hemispheres. On the introductory page, Florencio M. del Castillo notes that the city's streets number more than 482, that they are straight and generally well paved, that there is regular lighting, soon to be gas lighting, that there are about 60 squares, and that the population is just over 200,000 inhabitants. The plates that make up the work began to be published in 1855, and the first edition saw the sale of 24 lithographs by subscription. Due to the success of the album, de Caen made several subsequent editions in 1864, 1870, and 1874, in which the number of plates was increased. The 42 lithographs that are included in the volume provide a detailed view of places and types of the Mexican capital in the mid-19th century, as well as views captured from a hot air balloon or from the rooftops of some buildings. The second great work of Mexican lithography is Los Mexicanos pintados por sí mismos, a work that represents a stage of nationalist costumerism that, in a way, responded to the patriotic need of citizens who had witnessed the loss of an enormous extension of territory at the end of the war with the United States. Los Mexicanos pintados por sí mismos, which followed what had been a successful European model, originating in France and very quickly followed by the Spanish, is a book published in 1824, containing the description and image of 33 characters considered tipos, because they were women and men who carried out some of the most necessary traits for everyday life in the capital. The detail of the physiognomic features is as interesting as that of the costumes or clothing and the tools or utensils used in the traits described and whose virtues are praised. Both works follow the European model of albums of engravings, which consisted of accompanying the image with an allusive text, some of which were made by well-known authors. They are, therefore, collective works that bring together the views of a group of prominent artists and writers. They offer a representation of the most important city in the country at a key moment in the so-called national construction. The usefulness of these collections for recognizing buildings, temples, squares, streets, and monuments, as well as the people or types that populated Mexico City and its surroundings in that century, such as a seamstress and a typesetter or typographer in a modern city that shows the result of cultural mixing, the indigenous and the European present in its spaces and forms of social coexistence. Both works confirm the level of development of the art of stone engraving, which was introduced to the country by the Italian Claudio Linati in 1826. Octavio Paz, a multifaceted and prolific writer, dealt with an enormous range of subjects, from the conquest and pre-Columbian art to the identity of the Mexican, Marxism, the avant-garde, and the relations between the arts. His essays on poetics and his numerous collections of poems are particularly noteworthy. Octavio Paz carried out several formal experiments in dialogue with various aesthetic proposals, international avant-garde and post-avant-garde movements. Among them, the 1967 poem Blanco is one of the most paradigmatic works of 20th century Mexican material poetics. Blanco is a poem that is influenced, on one hand, by the work of Stéphane Mallarmé, and, on the other, through a quotation from the Hevarja Tantra from the poet's time in India as a diplomat. These influences are reflected in the epigraphs with which the poem begins. One of the most evident formal characteristics of Blanco is that the pages that make up the book unfold in the manner of a folding screen. This relates back to the reading of the codices and seeks a correspondence between the temporal and the spatial. Visuality is a central feature of the poem. The typographic features, the alternation of black and red ink in honor of the pre-Hispanic tlahuilos, and the deliberate arrangement of the words on the canvas of the paper create multiple reading experiences. In the warning to the reader, Octavio Paz explains how the poem should be read and provides 6 keys to reading it, as a single text, as a set of separate poems, and as each of the parts of a mandala. The column in the center is a poem that starts from white to white, passing through 4 chromatic stages: yellow, red, green, and blue. The poem on the left is divided into 4 moments corresponding to the 4 elements: air, earth, fire, and water. The original edition was conceived as a 2-volume set in a cardboard box measuring 23 by 18 centimeters. The first volume contains the poem together with indications of possible readings. The second volume, edited by Enrico Mario Santi, includes Octavio Paz's annotated handwritten drafts, facsimilarly reproduced and transcribed, letters from the author to his publishers, including typographical indications, and comments parallel and subsequent to the poem, essays and comments by translators of the poem into various languages. This visit reveals a small part of the broad panorama of the Mexican bibliography and its patrimonial repositories. It has also shown the complexities of its evolution that arise from its multiple nature. It gave us a first look at the cultural legacy whose exploration helps us answer questions about our history and our future.
Well, thank you so much. Goodness, that was a real landmark event for us. Thank you. It's a tour de force, magnificent, fascinating. It was hugely rich. I really can't thank you enough. It was not just a tour and history of those libraries, but the highlights of the collections with those exquisite details shown so well, from very early Mesoamerican codices to the Miztec and Gothic type to the precious treasures of the early modern and the modern period. I found myself at times really just staring at the screen. Thank you so much.